Okay, now let me show you how to update this customer. So here's our customer form. Note that the target action is set to create. Now here we have two options. We can either rename this target action to save and reuse it both for adding or updating a customer, or we can create another action called update. And here in the view, depending on whether the customer has an ID or not, set the target action dynamically. I'm going to go with the first approach because that's easier to implement. So back in our controller, here's the create action. Put the cursor on the method name and press F2. And then rename this to save. Okay, now back in the view, you can see that when I used F2 to rename this action, ReSharper automatically updated the action name here. If you're not using ReSharper, you need to manually change the target action here. Okay, back in the controller. Now here we need to check if this customer has an ID or not. If the ID equals 0, that means this is a new customer. So we should add it to the database. Otherwise, we should update it. So if customer.id equals 0, that's a new customer. Otherwise, it's an existing customer. Now to update an entity, we need to get it from the database first, so our DB context can track changes in that entity. Then we modify various properties, and finally we call save changes. So var customer in DB context.customers.single customer with ID equals customer.id. Note that I'm using the single method here instead of single or default. So if the given customer is not found, this is going to throw an exception. I don't want to handle the scenario where the given customer is not found, because this action should only be called as a result of posting our customer form. Okay, so here's the customer object in database. Now we need to update its properties based on the values in the form. There are two ways to do this. Our controllers have a method called tryUpdateModel. We can call this method and give it this customer in DB object. With this, the properties of this customer object will be updated based on the key value pairs in request data. This is the approach that you see in official ASP.NET MVC tutorials on Microsoft website. But I personally do not like this approach because it can open up a number of issues. The first one is that it opens up security holes in your application. So in our customer form, currently we are updating all properties of this customer object. But imagine in your application, you don't want the user to update all properties of a given entity. Perhaps only users with special privileges should be able to update all properties. Or maybe some properties should never be changed. Now with this try-update model, a malicious user can modify request data and add additional key value pairs in form data. And this method will successfully update all properties. Now the workaround that Microsoft shows you is even worse. They say you can whitelist the properties to be updated using the third argument of this method. So something like this. We provide a string array which includes the name of the properties to be updated. What's the problem with this approach? The problem is these magic strings. If tomorrow you rename one of these properties as part of your code refactorings, this code will break. So the bottom line is you should not blindly read all request data and put that in your objects. That opens up security holes. So what is the alternative approach? Well, instead of using this try-update model, you can manually set the properties of the customer object here. So customer in DB.name equals customer.name. Duplicate. Birth date. One more time. Membership type ID. And is subscribed to newsletter. Now, if you don't want to set each individual property here, you can use a library like AutoMapper to do this. AutoMapper is a convention-based mapping tool. So it looks at the property names of the source and target types and maps them by convention. So instead of these 4 lines, your code may look like this. Mapper.map customer to customer in DB. So it looks at the properties in customer object and then looks for properties with the same name in the target object and maps them accordingly. Now, to address the security issue that I explained earlier, if you want to limit the properties of the customer that can be updated, instead of accepting a complete customer object here, you can create a different class and call it something like update customer DTO, which stands for data transfer object. So it's a simple data structure, which is a small representation of a customer with only properties that can be updated. And this way, you can safely use a tool like AutoMapper to update all properties in that DTO to your domain object. But that's beyond the scope of what we are doing for now. So let's just revert this back. Okay, so we update the properties of our object. And finally, we call save changes and then redirect the user back to the list of customers. Now, one final step. Here, we are relying on customer.id, but this ID is not currently in our form. We only have input fields for name, date of birth, and a couple more properties. So let's go back to our form. We need to add ID as a hidden field here. And I personally prefer to put that just before the submit button. So this way I know where all my hidden fields are. HTML, hidden for, m goes to m.customer.id. Now let's test everything. Ctrl+Shift+B, back to the browser. I'm going to refresh this page. And then put a plus right here, save. Beautiful, it's updated properly. In the next section, I'm going to show you how to add validation to our customer form. But before we get there, I want you to do an exercise to master what you have learned in this section. So review the cheat sheet in the next lecture and get ready for an exercise.